What's up, y'all? What's up, y'all? You know what I'm saying? Back at you again, Iskosi Umfundisi. And we up here reading out of Cheikh Anta Diop's Civilization or Barbarism, Chapter 14. How to Identify Cultural Identity. Which is a big thing that's going on within the African American community, many African communities worldwide, is how to identify this, the situation we're going through. So we're going to read this and get into, a little bit more about this. For every individual, his or her own cultural identity is a function of that of his or her people. Consequently, one must be defined by the cultural identity of a people. This means, to a great extent, one must analyze the components of the collective personality. We know that three factors contribute to this formation. One, an historical factor. Two, a linguistic factor. Three, a psychological factor. Every attempt to reinforce or to modify the cultural personality must consist of carefully studying the appropriate modes of action on these three factors. Perfect cultural identity responds to the full stimulation presence of these factors of the individual. But that is the case of the idea. In reality, one finds all types of transition from the normal to the extreme cases of identity crisis following a lessened distinction of factors cited above. Their specific combination offer all possible cases, individual or collective, where one factor functions fully, another is very weak in effect, or even none at all, as we see with the linguistic expressions of the mother tongue is lost in the diaspora. One can ask oneself which of these three is most important, in other words, which would suffice to characterize cultural personality and absence of the other two. Does this question make sense? Is such a case possible? To answer this question, we must review the relative importance of each of these factors in a brief analysis. The historical factor. The historical factor is the cultural element that unifies the disparate elements of a people and to make them whole in a particular slant of a feeling of cultural continuity led by the totality of the collective. It is historical conscience thus rendered that allows a people to distinguish itself from a population whose elements, by definition, are foreign from the other. The population of a large city market is composed of foreign tourists who come from 5 continents and who do not have any cultural bond with each other. The historical conscience, though, the feeling of cohesion that it creates, constitutes the safest and most solid shield of cultural security for a people. This is why every people seek to only know, to live their true history well, to transmit its memory to their descendants. The essential thing for our people is to rediscover the thread that connects them to most of their remote ancestral past. In the face of cultural aggression of all sorts, in the face of disintegrating factors of the outside world, the most effective cultural weapon which a people can arm itself with is a feeling of historical continuity. The erasing, the destruction of the historical conscience is also have been since the time it began part of the technique of colonialization, enslavement, and the debasement of people. The passage below by Mira Perret, set up by George Hardy, is proof of this. There is a subject in the world I will see disappearing without regret from the program of our African schools, declared Mary M. Perret, senator from Alexandria, in a recent article of the Annals of Colonials. It is history. A few readings during the French course will be enough to give them the notion of our country's power. There is an ever simpler way to give a clear idea of our strength to the native youth, which is to decorate the classroom with intertwined men of gang goals, which I guess is the French flag, and a set of miniature 70mm cannon on a teacher's desk. This by itself, in some measure, for a given period of time, can replace history. But one should not forget that our people very quick to getting used to scarecrows. The sparrows end up making their nests in the pockets of the gentlemen who gesticulate in the cherry trees. It is that these possibilities of cultural aggression linked to the vital importance of the subject matter that have led to developing nations coming out of the colonial night, such as Morocco, Algeria, etc., to make the teaching of history a national activity. In any case, the teaching of this material must be particularly hold to the attention of the state. One sees that what the importance of giving to people is not the factor of being able to claim more or less land gracioso historical past, but rather to be simply pervaded by the sense of continuity, so the characteristic of the historical consciousness. This could never occur to a working class people of Albania to envy the brilliant historical past of the British. The knowledge of their own history, no matter what it is what is important. This supposes a research activity that unfolds itself entirely in the scientific field away from ideological interference. The UNESCO is well placed today to know that Africans are capable of devoting themselves to this type of activity. Indeed, it has its own archives convincing them arguments on this subject. We have said earlier that a people without historical conscience is a population. The loss of natural sovereignty and historical consciousness, followed by prolonged foreign occupations, endears stagnation, or even sometimes regression and disintegration into the partial return of barbarism. This is the case with Egypt under the Romans, if we can believe Joinville. Because of the continuous loss of natural sovereignty at the time from the arrival of the Persians in 525 BC, Egypt, which had the civilized world from 1600 BC onward under Queen Hatshepsut, was cruising the seas with tall ships towards the country of Punt. Only knew how to build clay barges until the Romans in the 2nd century AD. Worse, she fell back into superstition and barbarism. Javel describes tribal wars between two groups, the Dendera and the Hobos, whose totems were Emic and who were supposed to have destroyed each other through cannibalism. This event is said to take place under the consonant Aleutians at AD 127. Even if one makes allowance and taking account that the fact that Juvenal was not an impartial actor and did not like the Orientals, one must admit that as a whole, there occurred a genuine regression of the Egyptian civilization. This regression strikes the Egyptian people in their own birthplace before any immigration. And this, let us repeat, was due to the simple fact of foreign occupation. The great enigma of the history is seen in a new light, namely, how did that people who build civilizations fail so low afterwards, and particularly the African people? It is clear an exhaustive development of this idea would take too far much space here. We are only sketching a brief overview in passing enough to provide elements for the answer. In any case, recalling so many facts is but a manner of emphasizing the importance of the historical factor of the definition of the cultural personality of a people. But then, what would we call an African history? We need to distinguish two levels. The immediate one for local histories, so deep, so dear, so deeply lived, in which African people segmented by diverse and stereo forces, and the principal one, which is colonialization, are shriveled up and find themselves trapped and are vegetarian today. The second level, more general, furthermore off in time and space, including the totality of our peoples, comprising the general history of Black Africa, and so far research permits restoring it today to a purely scientific approach. Each history is thus pinpointed and correctly situated in relation to the general history coordinates, the general historical coordination. Thus, all accounting history is reevaluated according to some new unitary standard, suited to revive and to cement and on the basis of established fact of all the inert elements of the ancient historical mosaic. It has become obvious that the feeling of historical unity and consequently cultural identity that the scientific research is capable of providing at this time to African cultural consciousness is not only quantitatively superior to those known up to now, but also plays a protective role of the first order in this world, characterizing by the generalization of cultural aggression. Thus, the emergence of a direction of a commendable research for the reinforcement of the cultural identity of the Negro African peoples. It is by this engaging in this type of investigation activity that our people will discover one day that Egypto-Nubian civilization played the same role vis-a-vis African culture as did Greco-Latin antiquity in regard to Western civilization. Definition. One could say that a people has left a prehistoric history behind from the moment that it becomes conscious of an importance of an historical event to the point which it invents a technique, oral or written, for memorization and accumulation. Linguistic factor. Let us move to the linguistic factors that constitute element of the cultural personality and a consequence of the cultural identity. it will be difficult to say that historical and logistic factors, of which these are the two most important of our angle of interest. We very proudly lean towards the linguistic factor. He who wrote, "As long as a conquered people has not lost its language, it can have hope," thereby stressing that language is a unique common denominator, a characteristic of cultural identity par excellence. But what does the African linguistic unity mean? Africa is a Tower of Babel, it will be said, but not more so than Europe, which has more than 360 languages and dialects. The apparent linguistic unity does not exist on any continent. Languages follow the migrating currents, in particular destinies of people, and the fragmentation is the rule until an unofficial historic, a political will, tries to expand the role of expression to determine the others. Thus, the speech in La Di Da France, and that the kings of France was privileged in relation to other dialects, Picard, Provençal, and Breton, etc. However, everyone knows today, thanks to linguistic research, that the superficial homology in Europe hides a kinship. A profound linguistic unity has become more and more obvious as it goes back to the Indo-European language, which is the mother tongue, the ancestors from which all present-day branches derive, following a very complex evolution. If we speak today of European linguistic unity, it is only at the profound level and released and restored to science by linguistic archaeology. Otherwise, the French, the English, the Germans, the Italians, the Romanians, the Lithuanians, the Russians, etc., do not understand each other any more than the Wolof, the Bambara, and the Hausa, etc. do. But African linguistic research of the past few years have reached a level where the kingship, the African linguistic unity, in a genetic sense, is obvious as that of the great Indo-European linguistic family. And we see the avenues that are open to affirmation and strengthening of African cultural unity. Similarly, it is a linguistic research, and not only that, which recently allowed the 20th century Europeans to experience the feeling of their linguistic unity. Before the research of comparative grammar of the German Franz Bopp in the 19th century, no feeling of a European linguistic unity existed. Africa has had delayed of only a little more of a century compared to Europe. It is therefore a necessity that duly conducted African linguistic research to bring our people to experience their deep linguistic unity in the same way as the Europeans have, in spite of the imperial sociology of the homogeneity. The results attained already allow us to undertake a cultural education of the African consciousness in that sense. Africans will quickly discover to their great surprise that their typical Negro African language has been the oldest written language in the history of humanity. It began 5,300 years ago in Egypt, where the most ancient testimony of an Indo-European language, the Hittite, goes back to the 18th dynasty, 1470 BC. This probably under the influence of a political cultural dominance of Asia Minor by Egypt, but this will take us too far. Let us only say that in the Southern African linguistic research offers breakthrough possibilities in comparative linguistics, which is about to reverse the traditional roles in this field. Be it as it may, it is through the study of Egypto-Nubian languages that the historical dimension, up to now missing, is introduced into African studies. The comparison that derives from it allows, from each passing day, reinforcement of a feeling of linguistic unity of the Africans, therefore feeling a cultural identity. The review for the historical and linguistic factors as constituent elements of cultural personality brings to light the necessity for a total recasting of the African program of education in the fields discussed above, and for a radical centering on these Egypto-Nubian iniquity in the same way that Western education system has its foundation in Greco-Latin iniquity. There is no way more certain, more radical, more scientific, and more sane and salutary to reinforce African cultural personality and consequently the cultural identity of the Africans. Psychological factors. Continuing with the analysis of the three factors mentioned in the beginning of our account, we arrive at the third and last constitutional factor of the cultural personality, the psychic factor, recognizable from the outset by everybody if it exists at all. The Greek physician Galen, who lived in the 2nd century AD, reduced the characteristic traits of blacks, persons to two, which appear fundamental to him. The inordinate leap of his penis, hilarity, strong propensity for laughter. The black person is flourishing as a human being with an ostracized genitalia. For Galen, these two traits, one physical and one moral, were enough to characterize the generic type of black. Even though Galen regularly visited the library at the Temple of Memphis, where he was the last Greek scholar 6 centuries after Hippocrates to consult Imhotep's annals, the brilliance of the Egyptian civilization was about to be forgotten and Rome was dominating the world. Galen was born 3 years after the death of Javon. We are witnessing the birth of the portrayal of the black in Western literature. Characters of identification of black starting from some psychological traits, more or less wrongly construed, will be pursued up in our days by the authors badly needing of definitions. V.I. Count Arthur Gilroy Goebel, the ideological ancestor of the Nazis. For him, all art was a result of a marriage between a vegetative sensibility of the black, an inferior quality, and the Apollonian rationale of the white, a superior quality. He writes, went to the rigorous conclusion that the source from which arts have sprung is alien to the civilization instincts. It is hidden in the blood of the blacks. This, one might say, is a beautiful crown that I put on the forehead of the black. It is an honor that I must give to him rather than around him in a harmonious choir of the muses. The honor is not so great. I did not say that all muses were gathered there. The noblest ones are missing for those who use thought, and those who prefer beauty to passion. Let someone translate the Odyssey for him, in particular meaning between Ulysses and Odysseus, and a sublime example of thought of inspiration, he would go to sleep. In all human beings in that order of sympathy to be expressed, the intellect must be first understood, and this is where the difficulty lies with the black. Our aesthetic sensibility of this being itself, beyond powerful beyond all expression, will thus remain necessarily limited in most miserable uses. Also, among the art forms that dark-skinned creatures prefer, music holds first place because it caresses the ear with a succession of sounds that requires nothing of thinking on his brain. How foreign he remains to the delicate conversation for which the European imagination has learned and ennobles its senses. The white illuminates sensuality directed by science and thought were the first notes, as to say, to begin to create a picture. The blacks see none of that. He does not understand any part of it. And yet, let us succeed in awakening his instincts. The euphemism and emotion will have an intensity different from our contained delight and satisfaction of a decent people. I can see a bombearer listening to the performance of a tune that he likes. His face light up. His eyes shine. His laugh and his wide mouth shows. Flashing in the midst of his dark face, his wide, sharp teeth. Enjoyment comes. Inarticulated sounds make an effort to come out of his throat, and there he's restrained by passion. Big tears run down his prominent cheeks. A little longer, and he is going to shout. The music stopped. He is overcome by fatigue. Thus, the blacks possess the highest degree of sensuality factor, without which art is not possible. And on the other hand, the absence of intellectual aptitude renders him completely unfit for the culture of arts, culture of the arts, even for the appreciation of what his noble application of human intelligence can produce significance. In order to develop his facilities, he must ally himself with a different gifted race. An artistic genius equal foreign to the three great types has manifested itself only after the marriage of blacks and whites. The Egyptian civilization, with its grandiose art, is entirely due to a black people. It is the most categorical fruition of garbled scholarly insanity. And we will not bother to criticize his constellation of errors. We only want to stress the fact that the psychological, the intellectual, and the psychological climate created by all the writings of these types strongly condition the first definitions that the Negro African thinkers of this period, between the two world wars, had tried to give their culture. The Nigger two poets did not at the same time have the scientific means to refute or to question these types of errors. Scientific truth had been white for such a long time, and with the help of writings of Leon, Lucien Levy Buffdar, and all these affirmations made it under the scientific banner due to be accepted as by our submissive people. Therefore, Negritude movement accepted this so-called inferiority and boldly assumed in a field view of the world. Amin Sincere shouted, "Those who explore neither sea nor sky," and Leo S.L. Solar, "emotion is Negro and reason is Greek." Wow. Thus, everybody was led step by step to Pacific too much, and maybe granted privilege to this psychic constitute a third factor of the personality, which everybody else simply calls national temperament, and which varies from the Slav to the German, from the Latin to the Papan. The slope was too slippery and everybody followed. This is due to the fact that this is the last factor is traditionally grasped in a quantitative way through literature, particularly through poetry. All people have sung their virtues, whereas the other two factors, historical and linguistics, are susceptible only to a rigorous scientific approach. But today, in order to better grasp people's cultural identity, a scientific approach to the psychic factor can be equally tried. For this, in the context of the social historical approach, one should try to answer the following question: what are the psychological and cultural variants that political and social revolutions, even the most radical ones, leave intact, not only among the people, but among the very leaders of the revolution? If one tries to answer such a question with the analysis of historical conditioning of a given people and of the African peoples in general, then one has already arrived to some results relatively better elaborated than before. One realized that the commemorative gaiety, which goes back to Galen and Epioc, instead of the permanent trait due solemnly to the sun, is a result of continual securing social structures that bog down our people in the present and the lack of concern for tomorrow and optimism, etc. Whereas the individual social construct of the Indo-European engenders anxiety, pessimism, unworry about tomorrow, moral solitude, tensions regarding the future, and all beneficial effects on material life, etc. Today, with an explosion everywhere in the world of these structures inherited from the past, we are witnessing a new moral and spiritual birth among peoples. A new African moral consciousness and a new national temperament are developing before our eyes. Unless the structures resist, and how could they, this phenomenon of spiritual transformation of the people will become greater. Until now, the cultural traits that we inherit from the past are very good ones that we analyze in Unity Cultural d'Afrique Noire. Goodness, gaiety, optimism, social sense, etc. in this brief account shows that there is nothing fixed or permanent about them, but they change with the conditions. Africa is beginning to experience some strong individualist consciousness. And with all the usual consequences, how can one then explain the feeling of cultural unity through this permanent change? What is the cultural variance that we were talking about earlier? Why cannot we answer this question here in full detail? But we can at least recall that the historical and linguistic factors constitute coordinating, quasi-absolute reference points in relation to a permanent flux of psychic changes. In the blacks of the diaspora, the linguistic bond is broken, but the historic bond remains stronger than ever, perpetuated by memory, just as the cultural heritage of Africa, which is evident in the three Americas, attests to the continuum of the cultural customs. It has never been said. I believe that the difference between the white American and his English or in any event European ancestor is the Negro laugh, so pleasant inherited from the household slave who raised his children. And there you go. That's chapter 14 of Cultural, Civilization of Barbarism by the highly, highly respected honorable ancestor, Cheikh Anta Diop. And you know what I'm saying? He said blacks, the linguistic bond right here is broken. You know what I'm saying? The historic bond remains stronger than ever, perpetuated by memory, just as the cultural heritage of Africa, which is evident in the three Americas. Attests to the continuity of cultural customs. It has been said, I believe the difference. So it still goes on. We still pumping, we still up here kicking, and so it still goes on. This is a real good story, you know what I'm saying? This is a deep book. Cheikh Anta Diop is a real deep guy. And he breaks down and stuff. But I want to get into this about the cultural, the three factors, the psychological, You know what I'm saying? The linguistic, communication, you know, and the historical factor. And the historical factor is the very thing that's important. It's the thing I'm really doing this because cultural unity is the glue that binds all of us. You know what I'm saying? Before you can get anything else, it got to be something that click us all together. You know what I'm saying? That's gonna say, yeah, that's my African brother. You know, we might do something different. Like I'm in the United States, they might do something different on the West Coast than I do in my part of the country, or down south, or you know what I'm saying, on the East Coast. You know what I'm saying? They all do different things and stuff like that, but it's still a cultural unity that binds us all together, and not just here in the United States, but worldwide. And this is one of the great emphasis he made on this book. You know. That got to be talked about, you know what I'm saying? As we said earlier, people without a historical consciousness is a population. You know what I'm saying? The loss of national sovereignty and historical consciousness, followed by a prolonged foreign occupation, endeared stagnation, or even sometimes regression, disintegration, and a partial return of barbarism. This can easily, he gave a case in point. This happened to Egypt under the Romans. And you can look at the artwork that's different. You know what I'm saying? When you see the Roman mummies that's in Egypt and stuff like that, compare it to the Egyptian mummies from way back when. There's no comparison. It's the same thing being under this land in the United States, you know what I'm saying? How people trying to knock the cultural consciousness of, of our people. They already knocked the national sovereignty. They don't want to say that we're a nation, you know what I'm saying? Now they're trying to knock the historical consciousness, And being under this prolonged foreign occupation, it renders stagnation. So you call yourself an American. You forget about your African ways. The ways that had to survive in this far and this long, So these are things we gotta, we gotta deal when we gotta define our cultural identity. What is the culture? Like you said, the most important thing in erasing the destruction of the historical conscience have been since the part of time, the beginning techniques of colonialism, enslavement, and the debasement of a people. So it's important to have Black history 365 days a year. Like I say all the time in my videos, forum study groups. Anyway, this is Iskosi Umfundisi. You know what I'm saying? Hope y'all enjoy, man. And got some knowledge from our ancestors, Cheikh Anta Diop. Enjoy, one love, and subscribe to the channel. Peace.